getting sleepy. You are getting sleepier. Sleepier. You are falling into a deep, deep trance. Hope I didn't hypnotize you guys. Buongiorno here. Hypnotizing people and smoking a cigar in homage to our man of the hour, who will be Sigmund Freud, who used to initially hypnotize people in order to discover what was in the contents of what he called the unconscious. And he was also very fond of smoking cigars. Some of you might think that I'm making fun of you, poking at your not being awake, possibly. Got a lot to go through today. We got a lot to cover. First, we have to go back and finish up with ideological criticism. We got to the point where we were talking about Guy Debord and Society of the Spectacle, which we happened to be reading in the other class. And we were talking about Marxism and Gramsci, and Berger will finish up the chapter talking about some other ideologies other than Marxism, primarily feminisms in its different variants, and also the work of Alex Wildelver, and his ideas of political types and group and grid theory and all that. So, with no further ado, let's get into... What are you doing, Buongiorno? Want to just go back over what Berger considers to be Marx's basic tenets, which there's 5 of them. He says, in all countries, the base or mode of economic relations shapes the superstructure. And we talked about what the superstructure was, as opposed to the base. In all countries, the base or mode of economic relations shapes the superstructure. Institutions such as art, religion, and education that shapes people's consciousness. The whole idea, remember, being that it was the economic base, it was the economics, it was the core of his ideas of what drove the other aspects of society, whether it be during your leisure time or in the ways in which politics operated, all that society as such was considered the superstructure. Number 2, there are different classes in bourgeois societies. The whole idea is predicated on this idea of class, all right? And we have to understand class, right? The bourgeoisie, or the bourgeois, is the ruling class. Basically, when he refers to the bourgeois, he's referring to those who, the factory owners and the property owners, and what we would consider like the 1%, right? The bourgeois is the ruling class, the proletariat, and I don't know if we touched upon this term in our last lecture, but the proletariat was just another word that he used for the working class, and we talked about the ways in which the working class, our ideas on the working class were starting to change in lieu of recent financial happenings, such as the economic crash of 2008. And I would even go as far as hazarding the pandemic that we're currently going through. There are some people projecting a possible 30% unemployment rate, which in relation to the peak unemployment rate during the Great Depression, that was the depression after the crash after the stock market crash of 1929 was peaked out at 24.5%. So, I mean, do the math, do the numbers here, and think about what the situation is looking like. The bourgeois is the ruling class. The proletariat is the bourgeois is the ruling class. The proletariat is the working class. The petty bourgeois, we were talking about upper level managers and people that were basically these kind of foot soldiers for the bourgeois. The petty bourgeois run the factories. They're the ones that make the media. They're the ones that shape the content in the form of the media. They make television shows and do other tasks for the bourgeois. For Marxists, class conflict is a basic force in history, he says. Class conflict itself is the force that kind of drives history. And to understand that, it's like, what does he mean by history? Well, everything, that leads up to our current situation, history as such. That class conflict drives history. And we're going to be talking a lot about that in our next two upcoming lectures in image theory on Society of the Spectacle, where I kind of do an overview of the history of the ways in which economics was done in the past and up to now. So those are lectures that you should probably try checking out. Bourgeois society, we talked about. Bourgeois societies generate alienation, which is assuaged by consumer lust or commodity fetishism, but only partially and temporarily. All classes in bourgeois society suffer from alienation, which means literally the absence of connections or ties with others. What he attempts to say here, I mean, we talked about this idea of alienation, right? And this way, and we talked about false consciousness and alienation and ways in which the dominant society keeps us alone and disconnected from other people in order to discourage the type of class revolutions that occurred, the 1917 Soviet Revolution being one of them. The whole idea of distraction and getting you caught up into a lot of other things. We had talked about that. Consumer cultures reinforce privatism and the sense that community and social classes are not important. The focus is on personal expenditures instead of social expenditures for things like schools, public health, and infrastructure. I want to repeat that. The focus is on personal expenditures instead of social expenditures for things like schools, public health, and infrastructure. What we are seeing currently one could make a fairly reasonable, cogent case about the spread and the virulence and the unpreparedness of, on a global level, of being able to properly administrate and deal and contain this particular pandemic that we're all being isolated from each other from, as being its very source being the fact that there wasn't enough money, there wasn't enough resources, with the privatization of the medical industry, with the medical industrial complex being privatized and based on profit. A lot of times, certain things that need to be taken care of with the general public. What public health should truly be, in the true sense of the word, is ignored or sidestepped or corners are cut. So a lot of the facilities that we needed, and now that we're requisitioning, we're turning everything from convention centers to college dorms into infirmaries, and slowly reaching out to the manufacturing sector to try to get up on some of this stuff, all of that lag, all of that procrastination and tardiness would not have happened if it wasn't for the fact that when you have a medical industry whose main goal is to make a profit, you're looking out for number one. Hence this whole idea of, for instance, masks becoming, such a sought after item now, and ventilators, being in short supply. This all has to do with privatization. Last thing he says, the globalization of the media and economic institutions allow the ruling classes to spread their bourgeois ideology and export problems to the third world. Marx called this phenomena cultural imperialism. And we talked about the ways in which Americanism is exported abroad, not only through consumer goods, but from our films. From our films and our television, that we are really the mothership, beaming its signals around the world because we have the means of production, we have the means of doing it. That's not to say that there isn't, a well-functioning, French television system or a British television system or British film or international film, but that we are pretty much Big Daddy when it comes to shipping our stuff and making a lot of money outside of the United States on foreign box office, And with that comes a shipping of our whole ideas about things in our way of life. And that's this whole idea of cultural imperialism. He goes on to pick apart this, starts, kind of dovetailing with cultural imperialism. He attempts a kind of Marxist analysis of this Guy LaRouche, I guess a very, very expensive perfume, that he wants to poke apart the imagery here. He wants to poke apart the imagery, and he wants to... Sorry, but I'm doing with the blah, blah, blah flip today, and it's throwing me off. I'm thrown off today. Says about this Marxist interpretation of this Fiji snake advertisement. One point a Marxist critic would make about the advertisement is that it reflects in graphic manner the exploitation of the people of the third world, the world of people of color, by people in the first world. This exploitation is done by first world bourgeois capitalist societies, the kind full of corporations such as Guy LaRouche, or Guy LaRouche as the case would be. According to Marxist theory, capitalism has survived by exporting its problems, and this, the Fiji advertisement, is really not only for perfume, but also a reflection of capitalist cultural imperialism. The woman is alone, and we don't even see all of her face. She's one more anonymous figure in the third world who has nothing but her first world fantasy, as represented by the bottle of Fiji perfume she holds in her hands. Berger's pointing out to the idea that we kind of project onto the third world this idea that they're just dying for our products. They're just dying for everything from our fashions to our colognes. It's this false image of this idea of consumer desire on the part of people that can't really afford it, would never be able to afford a bottle of Fiji perfume. There's also all of the sexual connotations here he talks about. And we in the first world are invited to her world to have our fantasy of uninhibited sex with an innocent and, quote, natural woman like her. But is she a natural woman? In some respects, yes. But although the flower in her hair and the snake suggest some kind of Edenic primitive innocence, the bottle of perfume she holds in such a curious way suggests that she has been captured by a fantasy manufactured by our bourgeois capitalist system of indoctrination. What city, after all, is more civilized and more bourgeois than Paris? So what he's trying to say here with this is, this idea, and there's always been this kind of this kind of undercurrent, this idea, and we see it in John Berger too, in ways of seeing the ways in which advertising attempts to appeal to sexual prurient interest in the first world with this idea of the savage, the mountain man, the savage from beyond, the uninhibited exotic woman, all these ideas that are, for all intents and purposes, racist, because we draw these kind of stereotypes and we sexualize them. They don't have the repression and the moral misgivings and the hang-ups that we do. It's like open, fertile territory. So Berger will talk a lot about this here in terms of the advert. He says advertising is then one of the central institutions of contemporary bourgeois cultures and is not to be thought of as merely a form of product entertainment. The price we pay for our so-called free media is much higher than we can possibly imagine. Advertising exists to sell products, but also has a political mission, distracting us from the breakdown of our civic cultures and focusing our attention on private expenditures and personal fantasies. We revel in our personal luxuries, Marxists argue, as our society disintegrates around us into chaos, and we take refuge in gated and guarded communities to escape from the dangers of the social disorganization and pathology our lifestyles have generated. Let me read it again real quick, because I think it's exceedingly pertinent and poignant in our current situation. We revel in our personal luxuries, Marxists argue, as our society disintegrates around us into chaos, and we take refuge in gated and guarded communities to escape from the dangers of the social disorganization and pathologies our lifestyles have generated. In image theory, and I believe in this class we were talking about this idea, this loose idea of that was based on this NPR story I had heard a couple weeks ago that was talking about this idea of the Shirley Temple effect. Shirley Temple, she was this young girl in Hollywood. She was a Hollywood actress and a dancer and an entertainer during the 30s and 40s. That her movies were very, very sweet and very likable, and they always ended happily. And everybody was singing. I mean, the whole genre of the musical kind of played this role of keeping people distracted off of their woes. One of them at that point being the Great Repression. The other one soon to follow would be, the cataclysm of World War II. I would say that, this kind of thinking, this kind of head in your sand, once we start getting into psychoanalytic theory, we'll start talking about all the ways that an individual uses different kinds of mechanisms like denial and transference to deal with reality. All right? And what Marxists want to say is that the capitalist system has a way of feeding you distraction in order to keep your mind off the things that are going on. Hence, things become worse because, we're not looking at them. We're not taking a cold, sober look at them. I mean, this is not, and I'm sure Berger would also agree that it's like entertainment in a society, has its cultural value. I think people think like I'm anti-entertainment, which, those who know me and those that know my somewhat omnivorous viewing habits and what I binge watch would, be proof positive of the fact that it's not about bashing entertainment all the time. It's like, we need entertainment. We revel in entertainment. It's part of being alive. It's part of the good life. It's part of going and laughing at times and just looking at a spectacle. Like a lot of you guys, it's like I watch the Marvel movies and things on top, all these shows that make me laugh and blah blah blah. But the question becomes, when a society or a person's in society where that becomes everything, where that becomes the go-to, the default in every circumstance, then there's no balanced diet of social consciousness and being aware of things, and sometimes being able to look at the hard truths of situations. We knew for a very long time. We knew since January that this pandemic was coming, that COVID-19 would prove to be a formidable and possibly pandemic situation. We knew since January, and the administration, the government of this country, and its executive officer kept on framing it in terms of a hoax. Kept on saying it was a hoax, never going to happen, it was going to be fake news. Well, guess what, ladies and gentlemen? That fake news that fake news has got some teeth to it, let me tell you, because it's keeping everybody on pins and needles, and it's hurting and it's killing a lot of people. That's how fake that news was, But this idea of being in denial about things, and looking the other way about certain things, that was an operant force in why this thing has gotten so bad. This unpreparedness. It's like our society's disintegrate around us into chaos, and we've already read about this with Chris Hedges. I mean, I think it was very, very prophetic that one of the people that we read in the beginning was Chris Hedges in America the Farewell Tour, because I think he was talking about a lot of the forces and a lot of the different elements of the society that were culminating in dropping the ball on situations like the one we're in. Berger talks a lot about blah blah blah. Talks about a lot the use of sex, the use of the ways in which advertisements sexualize the act of consumption, making it that much more alluring. This promise. And we're going to talk about John Berger here too, who we read in Image Theory, and this idea of the ways in which, it's kind of a cliche that sex sells, but the ways, and we're going to do a lot of this with Freud too, looking at imagery and taking apart in terms of its sexual symbolism, but the ways in which we sexualize the act of consumption. He gets into somebody that we read in the other class. We read, lo and behold, he talks about our buddy John Berger, who we read in Image Theory, and his book Ways of Seeing, which is the first book that we read. God, how much me and Arthur Berger think alike. It's like he talks about John Berger. John Berger. For those of you who have never taken my Image Theory class, was a British art critic and art historian, and he also happened to be a Marxist cultural analysis who had a show on a miniseries in the BBC that was hugely popular in the early 70s called Ways of Seeing, in which he takes apart the implied assumptions of classical art and the ways in which it was driven by ideology and driven by male domination and the ruling class and the rich, and how it kind of trickled in, or how it became the meat and potatoes of what later would become the advertising and publicity industry, and the ways in which those the underlying implications of Western art found their way and morphed into the ways in which advertising would continue to keep a class structure in place, the ruling class, in their respective ivory towers. These are quotes from John Berger. John Berger talking about publicity, which is really just another, like a Brit term for advertising, when he says publicity is usually explained and justified as a competitive medium which ultimately benefits the public, the consumer, and the most efficient manufacturers, and thus the national economy. It is closely related to certain ideas about freedom of choice for the purchaser, freedom of enterprise for the manufacturer. It is true that in publicity, one brand of manufacturer, one firm competes with another. But it is also true that every publicity image confirms and enhances every other. Publicity is not merely an assembly of competing messages, it is a language itself, which is always being used to make the same general proposal. It proposes to each of us that we transform ourselves or our lives by buying something more. And in the John Berger text, it's actually a little more, he's actually taking that out of context. In the Berger text, it actually gets more into the dynamics of how advertising operates on us psychologically and socially and sexually, and feeds and plays with our ideas of a false past and the future, and is always kind of predicated on selling us this ideal of ourselves in the future, where we'll be better and happier and sexier if we just simply buy a product, and that's one of the main takeaways from Berger's ways of seeing. He talks about other different dynamics to this idea of ideology, and he brings up this guy Rene Girard and this whole idea of mimetic desire. Mimetic desire, what does he mean? Mimetic is just a highfalutin term for imitation. And what Girard wants to talk about is how one of what he feels to be one of the most powerful social forces is that force of imitation. That need for us to imitate, and this is going to fall into what we have to say in psychoanalysis. From very early on, we use our parents and society at large as a role model, as role models for what is acceptable, what is not, and in that imitation, a lot of times there is this struggle that goes on between imitation and forming our own identities, which ultimately leads to certain phenomena like conformity and everyone kind of doing the same thing, and also envy too, because Girard will say here in the second paragraph, if imitation also plays a role in desire, it contaminates our urge to acquire and possess. This conventional view, right, while not entirely false, misses the main point. Imitation does not merely draw people together, it pulls them apart. Paradoxically, it can do these two things simultaneously. Individuals who desire the same thing are united by something so powerful that as long as they can share in whatever they desire, they remain the best of friends. As soon as they cannot, they become the worst of enemies. Let's repeat the last half of that. Individuals who desire the same thing are united by something so powerful that as long as they can share in whatever they desire, they remain the best of friends. As soon as they cannot, they become the worst of enemies. Think about some of the things that have driven our political landscape in the last decade or so. this idea, the polarization that has gone on, and the lack of civility and the bipartisan struggles and regressions back into populist movements that are predicated on hating difference, really, and being very, very, very unopen to hear the discourses or to hear any other opinions, and the ways in which the media, once again, the media being in Marxian terms, the media being put out by the ruling class, meant to divide us. That there seems to be often, and I don't think that this is putting our tinfoil caps on, as Professor Skinner says, to say that the media has a vested interest in keeping up ratings and keeping controversies going on, and pushing ideas out there that ultimately keep us divided, and is selling us on certain kinds of ideas of individualism, of being unyielding, of sticking to your guns, which aren't always bad things. Berger brings up, and we wanted to talk about feminism, and we wanted to talk about the rise of feminism, the rise of the rise of feminism as a political and social movement, which starts very early on in this country, from everything from the conferences at the conferences upstate, and women's the suffragette movement, and women getting the right to vote, and certain political. It was a political and social struggle, but also a struggle of ideology, an intellectual struggle, and a lot of feminist intellectuals would enter academia and start to pick apart in very in cultural ways the development of what we would call feminist ideology, as being a critique of what feminists consider. Every different variant of feminism would contend that the culture is male dominated, but different types of feminism would make contentions about it being male dominant based on certain different things. All right, there's radical feminists, there's liberal feminists, there's social feminists, and there would be this whole movement in academia that kind of started in the 60s, but really gets up and starts walking around the 70s, of what would be called post-structuralism. Post-structuralism and the idea, post-structuralism, which is a huge, I can't sit here and just give you this 5-word takeaway about what post-structuralism is, but ultimately it was a way in which the culture started to rethink some of its guiding ideas about identity, about mainstream, about domination, about different minorities and the ways in which they were sidelined, about third world, or what they called subaltern nations, about this whole idea of colonialism and post-colonialism, and about the ways in which people had been oppressed, and not just people of color, but women, and people of different groups. And the post-structuralist movement would ultimately be kind of rebranded, and not necessarily a nice way. A little bit of a derogation is identity politics. Identity politics being about the concerns and the rights and the representation of marginalized groups based on their ethnic heritage or the color of their skin or being a woman or their religious beliefs, and that post-structuralism, became the platform to rethink the ways in which society had disenfranchised people. And it was very, very critical at the same time of some of the Marxist tenets. These two things, post-structuralism and Marxism often go hand in hand. In a lot of ways, the things that they have to say coincide, and in a lot of ways they differ about where the true sources, say, of oppression lie. And we'll talk. And Judith Butler was one of the key post-structural feminists to really kind of start to speak about the ways in which gender had been socially constructed by those in power, and that it was an ideology, that gender itself, that the idea of male and female. Remember, how we talked about the downside of binary opposites. She would contend that all these ideas of gender were socially constructed, and that things were there was much more of a kind of continuum to sexuality and sexual identity, and that people that fell, and we know from history the ways in which gay culture and lesbians and homosexuals were marginalized, and brutally. But she would become one of the early proponents of a discourse about talking about gender being much more fluid than just about queer and straight. But there was like different variations of like the ways in which we self-identify, and the ways in which people use sexuality and sexual identity in order to express themselves. And this turns into a big kettle of fish for Marxists, especially when you're a feminist and a Marxist, because then there becomes these like questions of, what's the more important thing to go after. And Richard Wolff has a very, very interesting YouTube post up right now that makes a case for the Me Too movement, and Harvey Weinstein and Cosby and all these things coming to light as a symptom of capitalism. He makes a case that all this harassment and rape and sexual barbarism that's been going on in the workplace is predicated once again on the capitalist ethic. And I'm going to put that on the blog too, just to give a kind of different view about that. I've got to try to figure out. Give Bongiorno a second. He's like not on his game today. There's a lot of talk in feminist theory about the ways in which advertisements are used, and once again, this coincides with John Berger. He said, but Arthur Berger says here, what is it that makes the photograph of a woman's leg so erotic? Note the way the untanned position of the woman's body leads her eyes to her vulva. There is a considerate difference, let me point out, between the socialist conception that capitalism is at the root of women's subordination and every other group's problem as well, and the social conception of knowledge, and we'll talk about that in a minute. I'm all over the place today. makes a distinction between socialist feminists with a socialist or Marxist orientation, and what he calls liberal feminists. But he's quoting from a book by Steves and Smith. He says, in contrast to liberal feminists, social feminists as Marxists assume that the class system under capitalism is fundamentally responsible for women's oppression. At the same time, they agree with radical feminists. So there's a link up there. At the same time, they agree with radical feminists that, quote, patriarchy, gender oppression, is fundamental in its own right and certainly existed long before capitalism. Thus, most socialist feminists argue that patriarchy and capitalism must simultaneously be addressed, largely via the eradication of divided labor by both gender and class. Also, in contrast to liberal feminists' focus on how media affects individual attitudes and behaviors, socialist feminists emphasize the centrality of the media and other communication processes such as language, education, and art, and actually constructing ideology, including the ideology of women's secondary status. What is he trying to say here? He's trying to say that there's a difference between what liberal feminists see as the source of female oppression and what socialist or Marxist feminists see as the source of oppression. Liberal and radical feminists would see the source as being patriarchy itself, and that and they would make the case, listen, it's like, you guys want to pin the blame, you Marxians want to pin the blame on capitalism as such. But capitalism has been around for not a very long time, rather. And that before capitalism springs up, there's all kinds of oppression throughout history that is predicated on male on male-dominated cultures that existed long before capitalism. So that for you to pin the blame on capitalism is to basically, misinterpret where the true source of the problem is, and Marxist feminists will go as far as saying, yeah, it's like we have to look at patriarchy, but we have to look at the idea that capitalism, wherever this came from, wherever this, whole social milieu of male domination came from, we got to look at it maybe from two different lenses, which brings in this idea, and I've used this term before, of intersectionality, of being able to look at oppression as being produced from different aspects of society. All right. The problem with a lot of the problem with the patriarchal analysis has to do with the fact that, and it will come back down to this idea that it's predicated on this idea that history from time immemorial has been patriarchal. There's a lot of post-structural analysis of why that was so. Even like early feminists like Simone de Beauvoir out of the whole French circle would analyze the ways in which patriarchy and this like what they would call phallocentrism sprung up. But, I would also contend, and I would and I would defer that, in light of all kinds of ethnographic and historical research, we find many instances of matriarchal societies, or societies predicated on the idea of the female as being the ruling, at the very least, female rulers, and the idea of the feminine playing huge in the belief systems of a lot of Eastern cultures and third world cultures, that we find evidence for this everywhere. Even in Christianity, there has been more and more evidence, that's come up, because we always it's like Christianity is feminists like one of their big whipping boys, when it comes to the idea of patriarchy. But, a lot of Gnostic scholars and biblical scholars have found many documents supporting the idea that there was this idea of, for instance, Christ and the Virgin Mary being, in early Christian documents, being on equal par in terms of their power. We got to remember that, you know, the Virgin Mary was the mother of Christ, and they're finding more and more documents and writing and different Dead Sea Scroll, whatever, that supports this idea that there was this like real prominent idea, even in Christianity and other places, of this idea of the divine feminine as the yin to the masculine yang, and how, you know, ultimately patriarchy, a patriarchal society that was really kind of predicated on, you know, power, kind of like rewrote that history, you know, and there's even been like, this is like all this minutia that goes on in the Roman Catholic Church, but I've known a lot of Catholic priests and Catholic scholars, and there was this big movement for a while within like the Catholic Church of like rethinking the Virgin Mary's role, and it was called the co-redemptrix. Like, she was the co-redeemer of the world along with Christ. So there was this kind of inner nascent movement going on, even in Catholicism, of like rebalancing it back out and recognizing the fact that, you know, early, you know, tribal and indigenous societies weren't always paid. This is just a long way of saying that there's a lot of support. There's a lot of evidence out there that, you know, there was things other than patriarchy, and the patriarchy just kind of got the other hand, and it becomes a question of like finding the balance again that we have yet to find. All right. This will kind of jive with the idea of the social conception of knowledge. The social conception of knowledge. Which is an ideology that takes, primarily it takes the idea of knowledge being socially constructed is a fairly easy, if we use anecdotes, it's a fairly easy concept to unpack. You know, it's like, you know, people, it's like, have this idea, the term is tabula rasa, or blank slate. You know, that when we are born, we come into the world, and we never kind of just pick stuff up on our own. You know, we never pick up, like, for instance, you know, that, you know, how to go to the potty, or how to put our pants on, or how to eat with a fork and spoon. You know, we don't want to do we don't want to do that for a while. We don't want to do any of that stuff for a while. And then a society kind of, you know, spanks us on the bottom and sends us up to our room for not, you know, doing these things, so that the knowledge of these kind of mores is constructed by our participation in a group. You know, our knowledge is that all knowledge, a social conception of knowledge, is predicated on the idea that my phone is ringing. Lovely. Definitely gonna cut that out. Social conception. Bonjourno had to get up for a minute. Social conception of knowledge is predicated on this idea that we never get any kind of knowledge unless it's in a kind of consensus. It's social. It's like we come up through a society. We don't have ideas of our own. We kind of think with the whole idea of thinking with the group, and thinking in conformity with the group, but also, you know, on the other side of it, sometimes, you know, not conforming with the group. You know, like pushing back on the group. But that, you know, knowledge as such, you know, and knowledge as in different specialties and different practices. You know, it's like the practice of medicine, the practice of jurisprudence, the practice, the very kind of nebulous practice of art and literary and cultural criticism always, is predicated on a kind of consensus of, what is the correct way of going about things in terms of methodology, and everybody kind of getting on the same page. All right? So, that's kind of in a nutshell this idea of social construction. This idea of phallocentrism and the male gaze. We talk a lot about this in image theory. I hate to keep going back to image theory for people that have never taken it, because I feel like maybe I'm not properly unpacking certain things that we just go over up and down in the other class, and I apologize for that. Berger says here about phallocentrism. What's a phallus? A phallus is, it's kind of like what old Sigmund Freud said. He made a joke about a cigar being just a cigar, but a phallus, and we're going to talk a lot more about this when we get into psychoanalytic criticism, is anything, a totem pole, the Washington Monument, are all supposed to be like phallic symbols, a symbol of the penis, of the male erect penis, that kind of is used symbolically in a male-dominated culture to unconsciously or unconsciously kind of assert its domination. It's kind of a nebulous idea, but there's a lot of credibility to it. Some feminists locate the source of male domination not in the class system and capitalism, but in the bodies of men, specifically in their genitals, and talk about patriarchal, quote, phallocentric domination. According to phallocentric theory, men assume that the power relationships they find in society in which men are dominant are natural and are unable to recognize the fact that women are subordinated, treated unfairly, and so on. The institutions found in society, the roles played by men in these societies, and the representations of women in the arts and media are all shaped ultimately by male sexuality, and in particular the symbolic power of the phallus. Men, of course, do not recognize this and react with shock and often laughter and ridicule, reflecting their sense of power and dominance when feminists make these arguments. This is a shot from a film called by Alfred Hitchcock called Rear Window, that Alfred the Great, Jimmy Stewart, starring in this murder mystery in which he plays a crippled photographer looking out his back window and witnessing a crime. But a lot of people would contend that this film has been analyzed in feminist theory in regards to the whole idea of Stewart's character being phallic in nature due to this long cylindrical lens that he uses to infiltrate into other people's lives, primarily those of the women in the courtyard. And there's a feminist film theorist by the name of Laura Mulvey who wrote this seminal article some time ago about the ways in which the Hollywood itself, film as such, due to its dominance by men, an industry that was dominated by men. Both the content and the whole mechanism of it are phallic by nature, and that the gaze of the camera is, if the gaze had a gender, then that gaze would be male. And we can see it play out through Hollywood, from everything from the use of it's we see a lot of Marilyn Monroe and Rita Hayworth and Susan, someone from Basic Instinct, whatever her name is. We see a lot of female sexuality as if the gaze of the camera itself was male, and that's that idea. He'll go on to talk about political cultures, the media and communications. He argues that the viability of individuals' involvement in social life can be adequately captured these two people come along, one by the name of Douglas Wildofsky and Wildofsky and Douglas. He says Mary Douglas argued that the variability of an individual's involvement in social life can be adequately captured by two dimensions of sociality, group and grid, she says. Group and grid. Group refers to the extent to which an individual is incorporated into bounded units. The greater the incorporation, the more individual choice is subject to the group. Grid, on the other hand, means the degree to which an individual's life is circumscribed by externally imposed prescriptions. Group and grid. What is she trying to say? It's like they were structured by two primary forces that are actually very, very... They both make this point of making these very hard and fast, clear distinctions between this idea of belonging to a group, as being the group that you belong to, and this will tie into ideology and this whole idea of socially constructed knowledge. A lot of what you learn, about how to act in the world and how to do things comes from, let's face it, your family, first and foremost, maybe. The nuclear family, being a place, and Freud is going to get into this big time, how this is like this kind of like really the incubator for most of our thoughts and our beliefs and our ideologies and it infuses us in so many different ways as we go on in life, but also the idea of the extended family, the idea of your school, this whole idea of like school rivalry, and groups have this huge function in structuring our identity. But she and he, Wildofsky, will make this distinction between the group pressures and the grid. The grid being like the list of prescriptions and forms of the forms of behavioral conditioning and social engineering that lead to morality, right? You don't do this, you don't do that, you don't kill people, you don't go, out carjacking. These are all like deemed by the society as being wrong, But within that, within all that prescriptive stuff also is all that can be very, very pernicious too. Especially, for instance, in a family. Let's take, for instance, a family where, your father was in the military, your brothers are going in the military, but you want to be, an actor, and the pressures that might occur, or the other way around. It's like you might come up, in a family of really progressive liberal artists and decides you want to go and serve your country and just and get a lot of flack for it too. So this idea of the family, becoming part of this like prescriptive mechanism of what's right and wrong to do, in one way, it's like we need it because we can't have people going around carjacking and killing everybody, and hopefully that's not going to happen soon. Although it seems like whatever. It's like society, will hopefully stay stabilized, for the foreseeable future, so we can kind of stay safe and secure. But that it's like so that stability is a double-headed is a double-edged sword, because it also creates a lot of conformity and it restricts people, and especially where we're finding it a lot, in the last 20, forever really, is the ways in which gays and transgendered people have been marginalized. And for the longest period of time, we lived in a culture in which, the straight parents of a gay child were less than enthused, and with the prospect of their gayness, and a lot of damage was done. Especially if you lived in a family with a very strong moralistic Christian beliefs about, they used to say it's Adam and Eve, not Adam and Steve, and all of that, and finally, through a lot of through the suffering of so many people, finally getting to a point in the culture that we can be proud of. I think we can be proud to the degree that we're starting to accept these things, and we're starting to understand these things. Is everybody? No, but is there enough of a discourse going on where these people don't have to, feel alone and turn to drugs? And it's like for so long, the playbook of a closeted homosexual was self-destruction, and now we're seeing, our cultural, milieu, a shared structure of feeling in which, little by little, it's like, those people are being accepted, those people. That's almost like, the LGBT community would jump all over that. But you guys know where I stand with this kind of stuff, even if I have these little, slips of the tongue when it comes to certain things. But, that it's a more, at least in terms of identity, it seems to be coming more with gay marriage and everything like that. It seems to be becoming a more equitable arrangement than it has in the past, where at least these people don't have to live in shame and fear all the time. Is it more equitable economically? No. But we'll talk about that. And a lot of that is going to come out in the book. A lot of this stuff, I think, is going to come out in the book reports and the specific books that you guys are doing. So, Wildowski goes on in a book called Conditions for a Pluralist Democracy. He says, what matters to people is how they should live with other people. The great questions of social life are, who am I? To what kind of group do I belong? What should I do? Are there many or few prescriptions I am expected to obey? Groups are strong or weak according to whether they have boundaries separating them from others. Decisions are taken either by the group as a whole, with strong boundaries, or for individuals or families, weak boundaries. And I'm a little bit in contention about this whole distinction between, wherein lies the group. Because I think we can, speak to the idea of a nation, and the school, and the town, and the village, all that being groups. But the extended family, I would go as far as saying, is also a group. Prescriptions are few, basically what he's attempting to say with all of this is that, with this combination of prescriptions and what kind of group you're bound to, they have an almost deterministic influence on what your political orientation is going to be, what your thinking is going to be, and hence what your thinking is, what your ideological preconceptions are going to be overall. He says, prescriptions are few or many, indicating the individual internalizes a large or small number of behavioral norms to which he or she is bound by combining boundaries with prescriptions. By combining boundaries with prescriptions, the most general answers to the questions of social life can be combined to form 4 different political cultures. And I'll bring them out here with these 4 different political cultures that he says are predicated by the ways in which these 2 overriding factors, your rules and your prescriptions, and what your group boundaries are the primary constitutive factors of this. For instance, he says that if your boundaries are very weak, and yet there are a lot of prescriptions, you become what they call a fatalist. All right, and he'll give, Berger will give descriptions of this. Another example. For instance, if you have few prescriptions and few things kind of holding you in, and at the same time your group boundaries are kind of weak, you'll become more of an individualist, or so they contend. Because you conceive yourself, it's like, because the preconditions of a weak group and few prescriptions leads one, according to this, to be more of a kind of maverick or a pioneer in certain ways, because there's less holding you back. There's less holding you back. So a lot of this is very, very arguable. And there's all kinds of instances. He says there this is Berger kind of restating Wildowski, and he says individualists believe in this is what they are. These are the things they do. Individualists believe in free competition and as little government involvement as possible. These are the tenets of what now is called political conservatism, or the right, or the spectrum of the right to the far right. This idea of individualism and laissez-faire competition and little regulation and letting people just go and earn a buck. It's like the hell with everything else, the hell with society at large. And that, they don't say that explicitly, but they say that, in terms of their overall ideology, that basically it's this competition of individuals that creates innovation and creates the need for society, and the fact that certain people rise, and this whole idea of trickle down, that society, this whole great man theory, the idea that Jeff Bezos's and Steve Jobs and whatever his name is from Facebook, whatever his name is, that these guys are the innovators and the main forces of society as corporate technocratic innovators, and they shouldn't be reined in, like geniuses, corporate geniuses should be allowed to do what they want to do, and they should maintain a level playing. It's like, okay, individuals believe in free competition and as little government involvement as possible. Government should maintain a level playing field and protect private property. What that level playing field means for an individualist is very different, I need to point out, from what that level playing field might mean to an egalitarian, all right? Then he said, so this whole idea of private property, this is kind of a libertarian philosophy too. It jives with what is called libertarianism in this country. All right, elitists believe in that stratification and hierarchy are necessary and correct, but they have a sense of obligation towards them beneath them. The elitists are the royals of a society, and the old money. All right. The distinction between old and inherited money and these scions, the gentry, the titled gentry of European culture, and later on in this country it would have been, old money and the whole idea of inheritance, and all of that is elitist, and the whole idea of we gained what we had through our labors of being, the dukes and dukes of the manor, and that. But that at the same time, they feel this magnanimous social concern for those less privileged for them, so that they feel that they need to be helped in some way. Those who fell short of the mark, those who were not privileged enough by the configuration of the stars to come up in an upper class noble family, should have some crumbs from the table thrown to them, and they should be taken care of in certain ways. We don't want to be monsters about it. And this is this elitist attitude. So that we can see where, for instance, there's not these clear dividing lines between elitist and individualist. In fact, one can say that, the individualist of today who becomes wildly successful becomes the elitist of tomorrow. The whole idea of like, all these like robber barons coming from poverty and like just like kind of lifting themselves up by their own bootstraps and rising to be CEOs of corporations. They always make this case for, there's this whole ongoing ridiculous debate in our country about, like for instance, political candidates who make a virtue out of the fact that, I came up from nothing. My parents were hard working blue collar people, and that's supposed to be like their selling point. And sometimes it's like politicians will actually kind of use that, like they're working class blue collar grass to like go up against, and it's all smoke and mirrors. It's all idea to go up against, like, well, he was a moneyed elitist and he came from a blah blah blah, and he was the head of all these industries. I know what the common people need because I came from them. So there's all these different flavors of these different things. But before we finish, I need to get into egalitarians, on the other hand, focus their attention on the fact that everyone has certain needs to be looked after. Thus, they try to raise up the fatalists, and we'll find out what the fatalists are. Egalitarians, what is egalitarian? Egalitarians are just people. It comes from the word equal, and is predicated on this idea that people should be equal, and not only be equal in the realm of the law, where constitutionally it's clearly stated in any kind of like constitutional democracy, of modern times, but that there should be, egalitarians go as far as saying that there should be some divvying up of the spoils of, industry, that a couple of kids, it shouldn't be like, take for instance like a party, it's like, let's say you go to a party, you go to a kegger, but there's only enough beer for like 4 people, and everybody else doesn't have any beer. It's not a very good party now, is it? That's the whole idea of the egalitarians. They just figure in order for it, just think of egalitarians as like being like, in order for it to be a halfway decent party society, everybody's got to have a beer, and that's that. Egalitarians tend to be in opposition to mainstream American political thought. I want to pick that apart, and I want to hover on that a minute. Egalitarians tend to be in opposition to mainstream American political thought. All right? Think about what has become mainstream, and think about the tenets and the documents and the struggles that this nation sprang up upon. All these ideas embedded in the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence that says that all men are created equal, and all of the different amendments to the Constitution, creating, as if this process that I would contend that this whole process. So sorry, I had to restart this. My journal got interrupted by an important call from his medical insurance people, and it just kind of wreaked havoc with my flow, if there was a flow. It's a work in progress, folks. I just wanted to, like, in the few minutes we had left, like, wrap this up. This whole idea of, like, egalitarians tending to be in opposition to mainstream American political thought, I would contend here, and why I underlined this is the idea that what mainstream political thought has morphed into, in terms of its sense of individualism, in terms of elitism, runs counter to many of the egalitarian principles, and we read Chris Hedges, many of the egalitarian principles that the founding fathers had based the country on, so we need to take that into account when we're speaking of these different types, these different political types. he says one of the values of Wildowski's analysis of political culture is that it shows how each of them responds to certain problems, such as how to deal with envy and leadership, who to blame when things go wrong, what to do about risk and related matters. The responses of each culture to these and other matters are dealt with in Table 5.1, which shows the attributes of the 4 political cultures. In later years, Wildowski would change some of his terms. We see from Table 5.1 that 4 political cultures deal with matters such as equality, ostentation, scarcity. But, and then he has a list, of how each of these different political cultures treat different fundamental ideas, such as leadership. For instance, the individual is each his own leader. Elitist is about authority. Egalitarian rejects leadership. And a fatalist is basically somebody that is led by other people. They believe, and we didn't really talk about fatalists, but it's like fatalists believe they are victims of bad luck and tend to be apolitical. And that's a very, very interesting, way of typifying an entire group of people. This idea of because certainly I would contend that a lot of what this mainstream American ideology has done up to this point is really generated this kind of fatalism, all right? And I'll explain that later on, how, and even like Chris Hedges goes into a lot of this, how, and I would especially look at that blog that I put up, the Extra Credit blog, where Chris is at a conference talking about Antonio Gramsci and this idea of hegemony. So I'm going to end it there for now. We're not going to be able to get into psychoanalysis today. I apologize. I had all my props ready to do just that. That didn't happen, but we'll get right up on that in the next lecture. Hopefully people are working on your book reports. Contact me via email if there's any problems with that, if there's any questions concerning the guidelines. And I've seen a noticeable paucity, a noticeable dearth, a noticeable absence of certain people commenting on the blog. People, my friends, you need to get on the blog. You need to actually watch the lectures. I know, it's like, it's the whole doing what you have to do kind of thing. And, when you're commenting, it's like, I love the whole, like, great lecture, Mr. B, great lecture, Bongiorno, I hope you're well and all. But, your comments, dare I say it, should reflect the fact and be questions that have a direct, are directly derived from what I'm talking about. All right? So, it's cool. That's cool. It's like, thumbs up. Doing the Facebook thumbs up is all right, but you should push a little harder for more than that. So for next, so read psychoanalysis. That's the next chapter. That's what we're going to be doing. Move on to discourse analysis, and I'll see you soon. Hopefully, you guys are doing all right. My best wishes. Thanks.